said, "Oh, I'm so excited you're going to be in our place on Wednesday night." And I didn't respond back right away because I didn't know what she was talking about. And then I got the schedule and I was going to be here and I said, "Oh, that's what she's talking about." So can you imagine that it just came around like that? So it's obviously meant to be that we're here tonight and that we're working together on this very important program in California, which will become a model for the rest of the country, I have no doubt, because California will lead this. I'd also like to give honor to Mom as well, and all of the moms, all of the grandmothers that may be in here, because of your love and strength and nurturing and everything that you give to us, your children, and to the community. So thank you for being here. Benita, thank you very much for all you're doing with this project. So every time I wake up, I pinch myself, just thinking that I have the blood of two great American heroes flowing through my veins. And as you heard in the introduction, I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. That's pretty great, isn't it? And every time I introduce myself to people, and I say I'm the great, I'm losing count, grandson of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with all those zeros. But I bet just about everybody in here, I didn't see the young people down here. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you for coming. Just about everybody in here knows or knew a grandparent. Some of you may have known or know a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both Douglass and Washington, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. She didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson one day, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter, and she lived to be 95. And when I was a little boy, I used to sit on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap, and she would tell me what it was like to know, and she called him the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And one day, it hit me that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington and arms that loved on the great Frederick Douglass and loved on the great Booker T. Washington also loved on me and touched my hands. And I can say, even with all of those greats, I stand one person away from history. I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country. And as you heard, I've had the honor and privilege to dialogue face-to-face with more than 70,000 middle school and high school students since we started this work in 2007. And a lot of times our young people, first of all, they don't really appreciate history and they don't know the importance of history, but when they look at the great heroes and heroines in the history books, it's hard for them to imagine that they were living people that came alive and that did such important work and, most importantly, overcame tremendous obstacles and challenges to affect change in the world around them. So what I try to do is make history come alive. And that's what I hope to do this evening, is to make history come alive and inspire you with the stories of my ancestors. Because I'm going to talk to you about two men who were born slaves. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education. Now, Frederick Douglass never spent one day of his life in a classroom. He was a self-taught scholar. It was, as we know, illegal to teach a slave to read and write. And people would ask him later in life, "Frederick, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education?" And he would respond by saying, "My degree is written on my back." Booker T. Washington benefited from the work of Douglass and the abolitionists, and he was freed when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and he was 9 years old, so he was able to go to school. Both of my ancestors understood at a very young age that education equaled freedom, and that education would set them free, and knowledge is power. That is so relevant today when we talk to our young people, many that are living in mental bondage. And many of our adults and communities are living in mental bondage. So we want to be able to hang the legacies out there of my ancestors and many others that came before, that through education were able to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to again rise up and to affect change in the world. And we want those legacies and many others to be tangible examples to young people that no matter what they're facing in their own lives, what challenges they come up against that they think are too much to overcome, they can look at the great heroes and sheroes that came before and say, if they were able to do that, then there's nothing that I can't do in my own life. Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And we believe that if we're going to get out in front of this issue, human trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, that we're going to have the greatest impact short term, but also long term if we're working to build strong children. Now the question that I get two questions when people meet me for the first time usually. The first one is, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? They're serious too, they want to know. And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. It's a lot of pressure, as you can imagine. So I'm going to talk to you about, you heard a little bit about it, but what I do as president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and how we're working to lift up modern day abolitionists. Now the other question that I get is, okay, so wait a minute, Douglass and Washington were not related to, so you're already on this. You want to ask it? Douglass and Washington are not related to each other, so how is it you're related to both of them? Anybody wondering that? Okay, you ready? Here's how it happened. So my grandfather was Frederick Douglass III, and he was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And my grandmother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. They met at a place called Tuskegee Institute. That's good. This is going to be an easy night for me, I can tell. They happened to be on campus the same day in 1941. Now, my grandmother was born at Tuskegee, but she was living in California at the time, but she happened to be home for the summer. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he had been commissioned down to Tuskegee by the Veterans Administration during World War II. So they just happened to be on the campus the same day. They were rushing across to get to the other side and literally just bumped into each other. Didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. Wow. They fell in love at first sight. And wound up getting married 3 months later. So I think there was a plan there to bring the families together. And then when my mother, Nettie Washington Douglass, was born, she was the first person to unite the bloodlines of the families. She was an only child, so I had the blessing to be the first male to unite the bloodlines of the family. So that's how they came together, or collided, as we like to say. So Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to a black woman who was enslaved, and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his master. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was 8 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old burlap corn sack with his feet hanging out on cold winter nights, because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother 3 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to pick cotton in the fields from sunup to sundown. She would walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and at the age of 6 years old, he was going to enter, as he said, the hells of the gates of slavery. And his grandmother said, we're going to go on a 20-mile walk. And that walk was to the main plantation, the White House plantation, which, by the way, is still there today. It's still owned by the same family that owned Frederick Douglass. And walking through that plantation, that house, is a powerful, surreal moment because it looks like a museum, and you see all of the wealth that was built off the backs of people that were enslaved on that plantation. So you have this little boy who is now making this walk, and he's not sure where they're going. So he's nervous, and he's clinging to his grandmother's skirt. She's carrying him much of the way when he can't carry himself. And they would make that last mile walk. And I always, for years and years and years, I thought about what must that moment have been like when the grandmother, knowing that she was going to drop him off and never see him again, what happened? And I always thought about, well, it must have been very traumatic. It must have been a lot of crying and clinging and screaming. That's the way that I always thought about it. And a couple of years ago, I was with some students. And students, you guys are so smart. And you come up with great answers and ideas. And so I was talking about that moment. And this young girl raised her hand and she said, Mr. Morris, my grandmother is really strong. And she said, I bet you his grandmother said something to him in that moment that was going to give him the strength to carry on and to go on to be great. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in that conversation, but I like thinking about that because that could have happened. I mean, she saw this bright young child and had to give him some words of wisdom and encouragement and love to send him on his way. So he would run off to see where he was and turn around and look back for his grandmother, and his grandmother is gone, and he would never see her again. So he's truly alone now. But he had something that he called divine providence in his favor happen when he was 9 years old. Now this moment in time changed history, changed the course of history. When we talk to young people, we always want you to know that we're making history today. Every moment we're making history for what's going to happen after this moment in time. So never take any moment in time for granted. And what happened was his master chose him out of all of the slave children on the plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother. Now the importance of this move was he was leaving the plantation where he wasn't in an environment where he could learn to read and write, and he was now going to be in the big city. He was going to be around free black children that knew how to read and write, and he was going to be around white children. But what happened most importantly was his slave mistress, she had never had slaves before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. That's right. So she began to teach young Frederick his ABCs. But when her husband found out about it, when Frederick's master found out, he got mad. And he yelled at his wife, and he yelled at Frederick, and he said, you cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. Did you hear that message? Is that a message that's relevant today? In fact, that's at the heart of all of the work that we're doing with young people and communities, is unfitting communities to allow slavery to thrive and exist through education. Institutionalized education that, as Vanessa said, is not inoculation, but it's ongoing education, true education. So Frederick looked at his master and he said, if he doesn't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there, again, that knowledge is power, and it would be his key to freedom. So he began to teach himself to read and write. And he would do that by trading bread for reading lessons. Or he would pick up something off the ground, and while he's in the neighborhood with the kids, he would go over to Susie and he would say, is this how you write an S? And she would say, no, Freddie D, this is how you write an S. And he filed that away and he went on. In his first autobiography, The Narrative, which was published in 1845, in there he wrote, as a slave child, he was always so hungry. He always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a pig's trough, and all the children would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there. To eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He didn't own himself. Someone else owned him. And he was no better than the sheep and the cattle and the horses. And if you looked at the master's ledger of assets, you would see cattle, you would see a plantation, land, horse carriages, and then on that line item, one slave boy named Fred, 9 years old, with a value next to him. So now if we jump back to what I just told you about how he taught himself to read and write, he traded bread. He traded food, something that was so important to him and had such great value. He would rather go hungry and get that knowledge to feed his mind than eat. So it's a question that we love to always pose to young people. Now, of course, it's not an apples to apples question because our young people know how to read, but they get the message when they start thinking about what do they value. And I was just in a classroom yesterday and I asked the kids, what do you value? And they said, well, we like PlayStations and Wii's and Madden football and the iPhone 16 and what? Yeah, they corrected me. It was the iPhone 6S. But they get the point. And I know you all get the point too. So what his master predicted happened. And I'm telling you these stories because I want you to understand his contribution and his importance to this country. And I can't dive deep into this or we would be here for 2 hours, but I'm hoping that I'm sparking enough of your interest that you'll want to go out, especially the young people that are here, and want to learn more about my ancestors. So what his master predicted happened. He became unfit to be a slave. He became unruly. And he's getting older and he's getting stronger and he's getting smarter. And he's walking around and he's thinking, while I'm not physically free from the chains that bind me, I'm on my way to being mentally free. And they could not break him. The master and the overseer could not break him down. So he was hired out to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey. Now, Covey had a reputation for breaking slaves. That's what he did. That was his job. They figured, well, we're going to hire Frederick out to him for a year because that's how long it's going to take. And Covey began to whip him. He'd whip him so bad that the welts on his back wouldn't have a chance to heal, and he would whip him again. And then later in life, again in that autobiography, Frederick wrote that the pen with which I'm writing these words and putting these words to paper, I could rest in the cracks and fissures of my feet that have never closed shut. So he's continuing to take these beatings. And he said that he was almost to the level of a brute. He was almost broken to the level of an animal. But there was something inside of him, some spirit that just boiled up and welled up and just came out. And he decided to strike his own blow for his own liberation. And he fought back. Now, he was smart enough not to have a fist fight with Covey because he knew that wouldn't be a great thing. So he was strategic in the way that he went about defeating him. And they had this epic 2-hour battle or wrestling match. So if you can imagine, they're holding each other and you have Frederick, who's a big boy, and people start to gather around and they're watching, and Covey needs help and he starts asking people, help me, and nobody wanted to mess with Frederick. And finally, Covey gave up. He had had enough. After that encounter, he never laid another finger on Frederick. And they were together for another 6 months. And not only that, remember I said he had this reputation and he didn't want it to get out, that this young guy had beaten him down. So Frederick is walking around and he now knows, I am on my way to freedom. And he said to Covey, you have seen how a boy was made a slave. Now you've seen how a slave was made a man. That's right. That's right. Frederick was a bad boy. Shut your mouth. I can tell we're all held by the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Frederick had heard the word abolitionist. He heard his master talking about it, and he knew that his master hated it, so it must be good. So he found himself at this meeting, and Garrison heard that he had this fugitive slave in the audience. And so he asked Frederick, he said, will you just come up here and will you just tell the audience your story? What was it like to be enslaved? And he said he was so nervous when he first got up. He's coming out of 20 years of trauma and brutality and everything that goes with that. And so he's nervous. His knees are knocking together, as he said. He's shaking from every limb. But he stood up, and God had blessed him with the ability to communicate. He was theatrical. He was charismatic. And he communicated the inhumanity of slavery in a way that nobody before him ever had. So you have the slave master and the federal government and those that were pro-slavery that had put into the public consciousness what a slave was. not worthy of freedom, not worthy of citizenship. They were happy, they were amiable, they were savages from Africa, so they're better off in slavery. This is what the public thinks about a slave. So now you have Frederick Douglass standing up in his suit, looking good, educated, eloquent, and he's telling the true story. So today's survivors, there's nobody that's more qualified to speak out against the kinds of injustices that he survived or that today's survivor leaders went through. So I applaud all of you. It's the most important part of what we're doing. And that was Frederick Douglass's importance. So Garrison and the Garrisonians said, hey, Frederick, can you come with us and let's go city to city and you just tell your story. Leave the thinking to us, but you just tell your story. Frederick wasn't so happy with that part of it because he wanted to think for himself. But in the beginning, he's a young boy, he's 22, so he's telling a story. Then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt he was a slave. They said, look at it. Look at the way he speaks. Look at how he carries himself. He was shattering every notion that the people had about what a slave looked like. And they couldn't wrap their minds around what they were seeing. So in order to prove that he had been enslaved, he wrote his first autobiography. It became a bestseller. It made him an instant celebrity. Now, he had changed his name to Frederick Douglass to avoid being captured by his master. But now this book comes out, and that's the last thing you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book when you're running from your master. So it shows you the kind of courage he had, because in that book he named names and he named places, and he's named his master. Later in life, talking about forgiveness, he wrote a letter back to his master and forgave him for enslaving him. But he also said, I hope you forgive me for using you, really, because now, you know, these people are infamous, Covey and his master Huald and Aaron Anthony. So that, it shows you, that's why you always have to treat people with dignity and respect at every moment, because you never know. They had no idea that they would go down in history in the way that they did. So he had to flee, could make a connection that when you boil down the basic elements of what slavery is, it's about profit, it's about exploiting the most vulnerable. So there was no difference. And so those people that would push back against coming into the classroom talking about sex trafficking or slavery or racism, because we were wrapping everything within the context of history, it was softening the edges of this very sensitive and prickly subject. So once the students would learn about this, then they asked us, okay, now what do we do about it? So in order to reach more students, we institutionalized what we were doing, and we created a service learning curriculum called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. So we continued with this curricula over the years, and we saw students being empowered by this. The students that were the most vulnerable to being exploited were now being empowered. Booker T. Washington said, if you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else.
Yeah.
And our young people were working on this global issue that's greater than they are. And they were seeing that there were men, women, and children, but mostly women and children around the world that were facing greater challenges in their own lives than these young people were facing. And it was empowering them, and they were transforming through this education. So we continued on. We went into New York City, we went into Chicago, into some other areas, and we started to develop curriculum that dove deeper. And so we understood that we needed to start training teachers on how to implement it. And then once implemented, if a student hears something within the material that they self-identify with or to have the courage to disclose, then there needs to be a protocol in place so that the teacher, the nurse, the healthcare professional knows exactly what to do with it. So that model, along with Love Never Fails and Three Strands, is now where we are with this really important program. And history continues to be an important part and at the foundation of what we're doing. We're spending a lot of time in underserved communities, and so we're dealing with root causes of issues that make people vulnerable. And so if we're going to get out in front of this, then we have to make sure that we're doing this in implementing it with measured care, or everything will go wrong.
Right.
So history lives in each of us. History doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of, but history lives in each and every one of you. And we love talking to young people and getting them to think about their own lineage, their own family tree. And when they do projects, I've never talked to a student that hasn't found someone great in their tree that they could hang their hat on and be proud of. And what we found is that when young people start to understand and know where they've come from, then they understand that they stand on the shoulders of those that came before them and they walk in their shoes. And I've had students say to me, Mr. Morris, so does that mean I have greatness flowing through my veins just like you do? And I say, yes. And you see them sitting up straighter in their chairs. And you see them ready to go out and do this work. So history, it lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forth. Because we are the sons and daughters. We're the grandsons and granddaughters site. It's where he spent the last 17 years of his life. And it's on top of a hill called Cedar Hill. Has anybody been to his home in D.C.? Next time you go to D.C., you have to visit it. It's an inspiring place. And we used to go on field trips to that house. National Park Service took it over in 1962. And I loved sitting in his rocking chair on his porch because in the distance you could see the Capitol, the White House, the Washington Monument. And among all of the things that he accomplished, he also knew how to pick a great piece of property because the house is beautiful. But if you go in the house, one of my favorite rooms was the library. And in the library, he had books everywhere from the ceiling to the floor. And I remember thinking when I was younger, that's where he got his knowledge. Never spent one day of his life in a classroom, but he read every book he could get his hands on. Again, another message that is meaningful today. Read, 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 read everything. But if you go up the stairs and down the hallway, at the end of the hallway is his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum and they always have that rope, that velvet rope blocking off the room so you can't get in and touch anything? Well, when I was a little boy, I used to walk around that house touching everything, the china, the crystal, and the tour guides and docents would slap my hand and say, you can't touch that, you can't touch that. Except when my grandmother Washington was with me and she would look at him and say, oh yes he can. It belongs to him. So there's this rope. And in the rope, in the room, I always wanted to see what was in there. So I would stretch my little body and head over the rope so I could see in the room. And to the left is his bed. And on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to the bed on the chair is his Panama hat that he used to wear as minister in Haiti. And next to the chair on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And when I was little, I always wanted to sneak past that rope to try those shoes on. So when we first were getting started in 2007, I was at the home, and the first presentation that I gave in front of students was at that home. And so I told that story, and the kids were, oh wow, that's great, did you ever get to try the shoes on? And so I finished my presentation, and the site manager of the home said, I've got an idea. We're gonna go on a special VIP tour. And so there were about 25 students and myself, and we rushed up the hill from the visitor center, and I was knocking kids over to get in the house because I wanted to show them the library. Then I'm knocking them over to get up the stairs and down the hallway. And there are those shoes and the rope that have been staring at me for 45 plus years. Well, the site manager did something this day they had never done before. She took down the rope and she said, come on in. So all of us rushed into the room, and it's not a big room, so we were in there really crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, almost like sardines. And then the photographer was ready to take the group picture, and he started placing people, and he said, you go here, you go here, you go here. And he's getting closer to me. And do you know where he put me? Right next to the shoes. And I looked down, and I was like this, and I said, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip off my shoes. That's why I always wear loafers now. I could just slip off my shoes and I could step right into them. And no one would ever know. And I'd be standing there saying to myself, look at me. I'm taking pictures of Frederick Douglass' shoes. Finally. But I never did. I never tried those shoes on because I knew they wouldn't fit. those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I could take the shoes that I've got. You all can take the shoes that you've got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can make a difference in the lives of those around us, just like my ancestors and many others. We can go on to affect change in the world around us. And with that, thank you all very much for being here.